You can see the subheading here, taking a garden for a walk, because what I'm suggesting, in a way, we are only stewards in the roles that we have at any particular time. And if you think really in this time of global change, those sort of sentiments, the fact that we don't own it, it's not my role to dictate, we need to be a little bit more inclusive and think about not just those people in the audience who are listening to us or engaging with us, but those who come after us. And that's quite difficult to predict. So we're in an age of prototyping and exploring, but learning to fail fast. So what I'm going to share with you is some of those insights into that journey of learning to fail fast. I've sort of summarised here what I'm going to talk about. I think it's really important to not have fixed assumptions of what a botanic garden is. I face that every day at work, where people tell me what a curator does, and that's what I do, and they tell me what a botanic garden should be. And that's an interesting concept to me, because I don't think they're ever in a fixed entity, and I'll explore that with you. It's part of a PhD I'm doing at the moment in terms of reviewing curatorial practices, but also the collections management and thinking about the ontology, the classification of botanic gardens, because that's what we do, we classify everything. But then coming back to that question, so what? You know, what does it matter that we've got that diversity? Thinking about the different ways of knowing so that we can gauge others in society, so they can value and not overlook and undervalue those things that we care about. There's, through that, I'm going to talk about the growing awareness of the social and environmental systems. It's pertinent in the press yesterday in terms of how politics is having an influence on that at the local time, but I would argue it's always been a political thing in terms of the human endeavours, in terms of the way that we don't only classify things, but we also look to utilise them for our benefits. And it's only when we realise that our own benefits are served by others that we think about sharing that in community. And that's a good definition of community, really, when we realise our own interests are best served by others. I'm not going to talk too much about the history, current and future of the Dundee Botanic Garden as a sort of topic heading. I'm just going to weave that all the way through. And then I'll come to this over the garden wall, talking about ecology of placemaking, and come back to these concepts of rewilding the mind. That's a credited picture to D.C. Thompson that came earlier this week, but I was in the press, if any of you get the Courier. And I'll pick that up later on, because it's really interesting how you use words and how they're reflected back at you. And I can remember when I learned to teach, they said, you have to remember that you have to say it, it has to be heard, and then they have to repeat it back before you know that they understand. I've got work to do. That's all I'm going to say on that. So you heard that I'd been working in zoos, and I'd started a life in amenity horticulture, but then realised my interest in terms of botany required me to carry on learning, and it's been a continual journey, both in work and outside of work. In London Zoo and Whipsnade, I was the first curator of plants and gardens. That was the first position that they'd had head gardeners, but they'd never had a curator, to establish the collections and bring it in line with Botanic Garden Conservation International principles. That also brought, though, something the other way. So I was bringing something, but then you've got to be open to receive. And zoos are fantastic for meta-population management, something we still haven't got right in Botanic Gardens. They were also really good at working with their audiences. And if you think about it, what a zoo landscape is, it's defined, the way it was shared with me, is sharing the same landscape, but not the same space with the animal you've come to see. It's an immersive experience. It takes you someplace else. Part of a good day out, but so much more, because once you're there and in the right frame of reference, you can then receive the messages. That's an important lesson, because what we've heard today is some of the hard science. Here's what we've got. We've heard an analysis of that. But then so what? What do we do with that? How do we engage people and take people on that journey so that we think differently about those spaces? At Windsor Great Park, I used to look after the Great Park proper, all of these 3,500 of these oak trees. That's why I did a Master's in Conservation Management. But I also looked after the Flowery Mead, and that took me back to 1066 and one of the first recorded gardens in the United Kingdom, thinking about that space and this continuous land management. What I can tell you is that long spent on any landscape, bringing in organic nutrients ends up in a toxic soil, high in cations. It's interesting, isn't it, that we leave a signal behind us, even when we don't know. And it meant that we couldn't grow certain plants there. I had the same thing in Amsterdam Botanic Gardens. When I went there, they called me the English gardener, much younger and thinner then, where we were trying to help a failing botanic garden in terms of visitation, make a connection. And we did that through plant use themes and looking at the history of the Botanic Garden Amsterdam in terms of its original apothecary base, its engagement with the VOC and EOC, bringing plants from around the world, but then also this cultural material exchange back with the citizens, and now obviously at the heart of a global force for change. Only 1 hectare, but my gosh, it changed the world in its own way, along with Leiden. We'll pick up that later on. At Paynton Zoo, I found myself thinking differently about the way that we use exhibits. So why should I do another immersive exhibit? Why don't I look to grow food sustainably in an urban setting that will feed the animals and the visitors and take pressure off of the land outside of the zoo, which is effectively what we're seeing with conservation, isn't it? The reason we need to conserve is because we've got unsustainable land use and land cover change going on in the landscapes around us. It's agriculture, not climate change, that has given us the biggest impact of biodiversity loss. And in fact, I would argue that botanic gardens aren't really about conservation in many ways, because we can't do it. We can't do it in a cultivated space where we can only grow one of something. You need a minimum viable population into breeding of 50 to 200. So we need to do metapopulation. And also, we don't know how to put habitat back. You only can go forward into a functional landscape. And so I'll pick up on some of those threads, but I'm going to bring you back to where I am. So we've talked a lot about this urban flora across Scotland, and I'm at Dundee. I'm in the west end of the city, but I'm also across the centre because I look after the grounds and 7 sites that include an urban campus, a waterside, reclaimed land that used to be a a dump, and it's now a sports field with 10 different pitches on it, and then this 27-acre, 9.5 hectare botanic garden, which is laid out phytosociologically. I believe it's the only ecologically laid out botanic garden in the world still today. There are phytosociological collections within botanic gardens, but the whole garden was laid out that way, with the 8 Tayside habitats at the heart of it. Okay. Now, we have to think about the time frame for this garden as well. It's only 50 years old, and although it's associated with the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh in terms of the curators that came before me, Eddie Kemp was the first curator, and he brought with him many of the plants from the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. And in fact, Leslie Bissett, who followed him, was the nurseryman, who then also followed and brought many more plants. So I think our early collection probably owns its basis to the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh. But Hugh Ingram, this gentleman here, was really the spiritual designer behind the Botanic Garden. He taught ecology and botany in the University of Dundee, and those of you who remember him with one leg, and the records of him in the Botanic Garden when he was scouring Dundee to find a suitable site talk about him hopping over a wall, going through bramble patches with his wooden leg in shoot, hopping at some points. But he wrote this interesting piece in our only, so far, guidebook to the Botanic Garden, the tradition of using Botanic Gardens to illustrate the taxonomic or evolutionary relationships of plants has never formed part of the policy of this garden. Okay, so I think I've set the scene now about Botanic Gardens being different. Ours is young, it had a different emphasis. If you think about it, it was that nascent time, 1967, going to 1970, in between, we're looking back at the blue marble in a black sky, because those first television pictures are coming back showing that we're alone in an otherwise dark sky. And at the same time, we've got Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring, telling us everything that's going wrong with the way that we are abusing, in a linear economy, natural resources that we take, we make, we use, and we waste, and the pollution comes back because we're all part of a cycle. But it's not always been that way, has it? If we look back at these wordings, hortus conclusus, the closed garden, it was actually, to have a garden, you'd have to have status, prince, fiefdoms. You have to have strong elbows, or a strong fist, or a weapon, and land usually, wouldn't you? Because to make your own paradise on earth within a wall, because that's what a garden is in terms of its definition, to make this symbolic connection with the Mythian Elysian fields, you've got to be able to protect and make sure that your lands are private. And bringing nature within its bounds in your space, under your terms, is what those early gardens are about. They exhibit wealth and power and influence, and they're very different from what comes out. You'll see there's no timeline on this, because these things don't necessarily fall into what we call Renaissance period, when we traditionally talk about hortus medicus and the beginning of medical sciences. In the 12th century, in the Andalusian Spain, we find physicians using 1,200 plants in gardens. We don't call them hortus medicus, but they are for all intensive purposes. If you go back to the Egyptian times, you can find gardens that are written about where they're growing plants for medicinal purposes, but also for ornament. So you could argue they could be a botanic garden at that point. But I'm using a classification system here as a simple means to take you on a journey with me tonight. Because hortus medicus, which we do associate with that Renaissance period, especially in the West, about the cultivation of medicinal plants. It's the training of pharmacists and the cultivation of herbs. Indeed, at Amsterdam Botanic Garden in 1638, the original garden laid out in order beds consisted of 60 plants. 60 plants that were chosen, they were verified, and then they were used to train a generation of apothecaries. Because at that time in the Black Death, what we had is beta morci, vultures going around selling plants that were unverified, saying this will save you if you buy it from me. And so this was the counterpoint, if you like, of the municipality saying we need to change. So that, again, botanic gardens have different origins. Some of them are private, some of them are formed by the city councils, some of them are associated with universities, and we certainly see that phase change around the 16th century in Italy with Padua and Pisa. We'll come back to that later, but within 30 years, you start seeing those collections change from medical initially, because really of the economic importance of the plants. We see those themes come through, but also this exploration of the science behind the plants. We move from the morphology into the anatomy, into the physiology, as people begin to naturally inquire what's going on. It's also, the Hortus Botanicus is about empire, colonialization and exploitation, and we see that in the early writings. In fact, the 17th and 18th centuries were all about that growth. And you could argue that plants, tea, coffee, tobacco, cotton, and all of the links that come with that are the beginning of capitalization. And although we've initially put the emphasis on the money and the trade that comes with it, now we don't think about those products. It's more we've reached a time where we're thinking about the accumulation of capital, regardless of where it comes from. And that means we've become completely removed from that base, that natural base. The development of the major world's crops are associated with these botanic gardens. If you think of Kew and the work of Hooker, he established 90 botanic gardens as a network around the world to take a plant from somewhere, trial it somewhere else. You think about St. Vincent Botanic Gardens in the West, the first in the Western world, in the New World that was coming out. There they were growing initially medical plants for the British Navy as a stop-off pharmacy, and then very quickly they were experimenting with plants like breadfruits, so they had a cheap food to feed into the slave trade. So you see this all happen very quickly. They're still using order beds, they're still talking about medicine, but we also see the beginning and development of taxonomy and plant science, and certainly when we associate it with the university. What I'm arguing now is that these are terms that we use in the trade. They're not ones that the public know. And I would say that actually for the last 30 or so years, although we've had a focus on conservation, what we really have been doing is talking about knowledge. And hortus apatus, Latin, the word of knowledge, I'm suggesting that botanic gardens are a place to share and apply knowledge. The subjects are not just about ecology, because that says that we're removed from nature. We're not. We're part of it. In fact, there's more microorganisms in your belly than there is cells in your body, as they keep telling us with the holobiont. And increasingly, we are finding those connections with the plants in our garden. So when we grow a plant in a botanic garden, it's just not a plant. There's a whole ecosystem going on there. Every cell has got a latent organism in it. We just don't look for it. We don't talk about it. We don't share that. It's about global change because that's the order of the day. That's where we are. It's also about regeneration because we have to bring hope. Its concern is about life on Earth. It's about nature-based solutions, and I'll pick up on that later. We talked about some of that with the green-blue infrastructure earlier today. It's also about a just transition, because if we truly are civilized, going back to Kenneth Williams in the 1960s, a definition of civilization is how we treat those least able to look after themselves in society. Oh my gosh, I wish a leader stood up somewhere in the world and said that today, rather than looked after their own self-interests. You can see I'm on a mission here, aren't I? Because I keep bringing hope up there. But it's also not about the hard sciences. It's about the soft sciences. It's about the arts. Because artists, when you get art at any stage of your life as an adult, and it came to me quite late, what I realised is it's a time machine connecting me through the emotional connection imbued within that artwork by an artist in time, someplace else that I connect with. Oh my gosh, I tingle still today when I get those. And artists are really well placed to reflect that messaging. The message I say, the message they hear, and the new message that comes back. So letting go to see what comes can be quite a powerful opportunity for us. And ecology is in there. So John will be glad about that, because I believe that's the primary thing that we should all be learning about. Our place in, on, and part of Earth. So Hortus conclusus, there's this universal geometric shape that we see goes back even before that time, that's picked up, and it's across different cultures. It seems important. There's also a link to the skies, and if we could see up above us tonight, we would have, if we were 1,000 years ago in time, we would have been familiar with many of the stars and the shapes, and we would have read into them in different ways. In Western culture, that's come through the Christian way of thinking. If you look at Genesis 2:10 and read it again, it would talk about the river that feeds Eden with water into the garden that splits into two, becoming four heads. And it's these four heads that we see replicated in that quartile garden. We also see that shape then duplicated into the early botanic gardens of Pisa and Padua. When we see the Hortus Medicus, we pick up on some of those elements, that regimental scale, but we begin to see the start of order beds. This is a reenactment of the Snippendale Garden of 1683, which I helped put back in Amsterdam Botanic Gardens because they'd forgotten where they'd started. They had no physic garden there at all, and that's where they were. So we put it back and grew the original plants. Obviously, it's pre-Linnaean names. There was 2 years' work trying to work out what on earth those plants were. Surprisingly, there were 60 plants that he started with. It seems a common thread, isn't it? But there were 600 he quickly grew. And if you think, in the 1st century Common Era, one of the founding books that we use, the Materia Medica, is still having influence until the 18th century in terms of the pharmaceutical books that are being created. We see that come through. In here, we've got Leiden Botanic Garden. There's something else I wanted to pick up on this Hortus Medicus time, which is why I'm saying there's a material cultural exchange that was bigger than just the plants going on. So in Leiden in 1610, can you see these animals? There's a sort of crocodile down here. There's a tortoise shell. There's already around the outside of the Botanic Garden a curiosity museum beginning to establish. So this link between museums, museology, and botanic gardens was early on, and somehow we've sort of forgotten those links as we've gone on and separated them out. There's also tokens, so they're quite elitist places to get into. This is a token that was made for Amsterdam Botanic Gardens. Unless you had one, you couldn't gain entry because you weren't an apothecary or an apothecary's apprentice. But within 30 years, we see that 600 plants become 1,200 plants, become 3,000 plants. And I used the Dutch as an example, and I wrote a paper on that in terms of the Hortus Botanicus and these different plant use themes. As they began exploiting plants, New York was once called New Amsterdam. Here we've still got colonies, Suriname down here, the Indies over here, the first Indies with the spice trade. They were the early ones that colonized and formed an empire of trade around that. And indeed, probably that trading base is still what keeps them afloat, even though they're a very small island, because most of their land is used in some sort of productive way for horticulture today. But the crops and their wild relatives were shared. And indeed, now there's projects in the herbarium and in the collections of Kew and Leiden. They're beginning to try to look internally at those old strains of plants which were originally connected and we've lost in this narrow, reductive green revolution that took us to the epiphany of how many tons we could get from an acre, but not very resilient to pests and diseases or disorders or a changing climate. So there is hope in these layers of history that we can pull on as we reclaim that past, but equitably, fairly share it back with the world in a way that can help support maybe 10 billion people by 2100. We've also got fibre, and jute, jam and journalism is the foundation of Dundee, and there's a lot of that weaved into the fabric of our communities, but also the legacy of that trade being displaced again and going back to India is there. So there's a void, and we've been making a new tapestry, a Dundee tapestry, which will tell the history of Dundee, but also connect us back with the world through fabric, through the threads that connect us. There's also fuel and timber, and although timber had been imported into Dundee since 600 Common Era from the Baltic states, tropical hardwoods didn't start coming into the world until we see that beginning of exploitation and exploration of the world. Sorry, that's Louis Pasteur. And of course, the last part of Hortus Botanicus is when we started looking inside the reductive sciences and serendipity of Louis Pasteur, recognizing a Petri dish. All of a sudden, what he was looking at and cultivating was being killed off. And it was the garlic, allicin, that was doing that. And the beginning of that, the medicine in the modern form, which is now at the heart of Dundee University, because it's the #1 life science school because of the pharmacology that goes on there. And of course, we've got the exotic collections, which we focus on. That's what people come to see, but there's so many more layers to that. And indeed, coming back full circle, my predecessor did put in an APG4 Botanic Garden, Evolution Garden, which is at the heart now of our new garden that goes forward, sharing those relationships. And you'd like to see there at the top of my tree is the bryophytes, mosses and lichens, rather than at the bottom. We've reversed things in the way that we lay them out. So the 5 essential elements that make a traditional botanic garden are all here. A living collection and a collection plan, a documented database linked to the living collection, but also those plants that have died in the past and that material collection that we've got. There is a use of the collection, education, conservation, research and public engagement. There's also placemaking, because without the realities of a tourist destination, there is no money to drive that economic engine. And we almost were closed in 2008. Any of you that know that story probably better than me, because I've only been there since 2019. And that's because most universities could not see the value in a botanic garden in an age of molecular biology. Why do we need the living plant? It's in a way, it's sort of the same sort of thing with herbariums, isn't it? Why do we need that when we've got a digital camera and DNA? There's these sort of debates that go on, but it's not until some time later that we realise, oh, the herbarium's also got seeds. And those seeds are really important for that wild collected material 200-300 years ago. The DNA is there that we can extract from. And then, so that focus on visitor experience, at one point is exploitive, we need their money. On the other side, it's an exchange of knowledge, and that's what I want to refer to now. The way that we're trying to grow that knowledge, and what I did when I arrived, is collaborate with the schools who weren't using the Botanic Garden to establish a living laboratory. So our Botanic Garden is a living laboratory. I'll talk about that in a minute, but we started with 2 masters in 2020. We had our first PhD start in 2021 with the Daffodil Project, and now we've got 10 PhDs, and it's growing all the time. So I talked about this concept of hortus appertus, a theme of a place to share knowledge. I talked about human ecology and wrapping that into what a garden is. And I'm also going to talk about going over the garden wall, because I don't think they have to be contained anymore within the 4 walls. And indeed, much of our work is outside, reaching people at their point of need. Remember what I talked about civilization? Meeting them at their need, not them coming to us. There's no altar here. I'm not preaching. I'm sharing. It's a different engagement, isn't it? Why do I think that way? Well, part of it, in the human ecology, when you look at that, you realise that our social system is interlinked and sits within the ecosystem of life on Earth. There is an exchange of resources that go both ways, and there is a co-adaptation that we have to rebalance if we are going to still have humans on the planet Earth beyond 2100, I would argue. If you think about it in terms of habitat, and we saw an awful lot of discussion, it's obviously an urban conference, but the urban environment is the fastest growing habitat on Earth, even though it's only 1% of the Earth's surface. And that tells you more about what's being lost to agriculture, to climate change, to rising sea levels than it does just about that. So fastest growing cities in the world are now in Asia and Africa, and that will continue to grow with the rebalancing, if you like, of resources as people take control more of what they've got, and you see the legacy of the imperial age disappear off. So let's come to the living lab. What's that all about? Well, the living lab at its heart has nature-based solutions as the way that we work. It's about plants, but it's also about the conservation of biodiversity. My target audience is the public, but also professional engagement, helping those in a university setting and those that we engage with outside to think differently, to work with us, to experiment, to prototype. And the result is a sustainable land use. In the Botanic Garden, I've got a safe space. I've got 2,500 different species growing in 9.5 hectares. We can turn the water off, which is what I did. Stop using pesticides, stop mowing the lawns, and see what happens. It's quite a brave thing to do, actually, in many respects, isn't it? I'll come on to that later, because you do get caught out from time to time when you do radical things. But we can also put in green roofs, living walls, swales, urban drainage systems. We can bring water that's been long underground, above the ground. We can work out which plants we need to let go of. Styrax japonica, it's not going to do very well with us in the future unless you're prepared to give it water. But in return, we can also celebrate those plants that we're looking to be the next generation of trees and shrubs in the Botanic Garden. And there are lots of different models out there for how you can identify little Dundees in 2050, 2070 and 2100. I'll come back to that because we've got an urban relief project which is doing that for the whole city. By learning to fail fast here and putting a dollar value next to it, I can then experiment with some surety on the university grounds, 108 acres of site, which I can then help work towards a well-being campus that works for people, and that includes the students, which we need because they are the income source, along with the research of the staff. So we've got to be mindful of that. But their well-being is important, but we use nature-based solutions and we can explain them because we've already prototyped them that work. That, in partnership with the City of Dundee, helps them make a transition from grey to green and blue, which is the logical step. You've heard it here today, but we've got to be careful about what we displace, and I'll talk about that as well. And then obviously it acts as a beacon for Scotland. So where has this sort of thought process come from? And I remember first coming to zoos, I told you I was challenged, and this guy, William Conway, was sort of just coming up to retirement, but everyone kept on giving me a paper he'd written when he first became the director of WMC, Bronx Zoo, where he'd played on a theme. He had a devil and an angel on his shoulder, and he woke in a dream. And the dream was about this exhibit that he was being asked to build for the gorillas. He'd spend millions of pounds importing gorillas from the Congo and creating this habitat in the middle of New York. And on one side, he was saying, well, I can't justify that sort of money. Why are we doing that? You know, and then on the other side, it was saying, well, you have to, because that's what's going to drive the revenue of the visitors to come. And without it, if you don't do an exhibit every year, there is no reason for people to keep coming back. And that's the sort of paradigm he inherited. But then there was another message coming through. But you're going to displace a bullfrog. And if we can't share the habitat that's in our locale as a first point, we've got no right to develop a Congolese exhibit and spend millions of pounds on it. So he did both. But he did the native flora first and fauna, and then he returned. And in that, sharing that story, he set up a sort of humility aspect of being a curator, because there is a whim here, isn't there? I could bring any, why don't I just go off and walk down the Hindu Kush? Oh, might be good reasons not to do that at the moment, but let's go off to the Amazon and collect the last orchid, and I'll bring it back in a Wardian case. Look at the last orchid, isn't it wonderful? We've got it at Dundee, you can only come and see it here. It does my ego the world of good. I've had a great trip, but what does that do for the species? Not very much at all. In fact, nothing really. In a way, I would argue, it puts an illusion out in society that botanic gardens and zoos are going to save the world's flora. And if you look, if I was critical of my colleagues and myself, over the last 35 years of my career, we have watched a demise of species, and now 2 out of every 5 plant species on Earth is threatened with extinction that we know of. That's happened under our watch, and we can't do anything about it. Can't do anything about it, because the issues are bigger than us and our institutions. I'm not saying get rid of botanic gardens, quite the reverse. I think we just have to think differently about what they are and how we use them. One of the theory of change that I use to help me is Theory U, which goes back to Patrick Geddes' sort of philosophy around a pedagogy of open mind, open heart, and open will. It's a human ecology training manual, if you like, that he wrote. He was our first professor of botany back in 1890s in what was University College Dundee as part of St Andrews. But in the modern Theory U, which is Otto Scharmer's work at MIT, he talks about these 3 big divides in society. The ecological divide between self and nature. Earth Overshoot Day in the UK was the 29th of May. Yeah? So we use more resources per capita on planet Earth than our fair share on that day. After that, we've been living on somebody else's space and time. So Richie Sunak, you need a lesson in education there, doesn't he? So we now need, if everyone's going to live like us, another 1.5 planets to live on. Yeah. There's also a human rights issue, because that is not fairly and equitably distributed around the world. Not everyone lives like that. So we're burrowing off somewhere else. Where are we burrowing off? Jamaica. Yeah? Jamaica lives below that ecological line at the moment, but they're just about to go over it. Why? Tourism. Oh dear. Can you see the link here between those sort of joints? So there's another big divide between self and other. And this is one that's really, I'm a dad of 4 boys, and I worry about those boys giving up hope, because the biggest killer of people under the age of 30 in the world today isn't war, isn't COVID, it's suicide. And that's because a generation has lost hope. And that's increasing. You only have to look at WHO. And I'd say, don't believe anything I tell you tonight. Go away and do your homework and have a look, because that figure is just constant and it's growing. And it's almost a sort of, it's overlooked and not spoke about as well. But it's something we've got to get around. How do we bring hope to a generation who don't have hope, are disconnected with the environment around them? And I believe that's through nature and bringing nature to them, because that's certainly been something that's worked for me, and it's worked so far for my young sons. The other divide is between self and other, and we only have to see that in Ukraine. We only have to see that with North American politics. We only have to see that with Brexit, where we can other someone else who's also human and shares this planet with us, and make them out to be so different we can do things to them that we wouldn't do to our own kith and kin. I mean, that's I don't know, help me here. I can't work that one out. But there's something about one planet, one people, and yet we can other people. When we other them, we go back 200,000 years, pick up a club and knock them over the head. That's what we could do, because I take what you make, so I don't have to make it. Oil, grain, whatever it is, doesn't matter. This theory of change, theory U, is based on, if you're going to go with it, you have to suspend the voice of judgment. You've got to see things with fresh eyes, and I'll come back to that. You've got to suspend the voice of cynicism. It's easy to say, of course, that will work for them, but, we can't do it. And that's sensing from the field. What do you sense in your own sight? But most of all is about letting go, and that means overcoming fear, because we all dislike change. Every 2 or 3 years in my job, I picked up my children and my wife and then moved, until my wife one day said, stop, that's it, I'm leaving, you can stay. And this transition was for me a journeymanship in my life of plants and places where I was trying to understand the world and make sense of it. I'm sharing from the heart in terms of that side, because we've also got to be transparent in why we make the decisions we do. If we can do that, we're then present. We have this open will to make change. We've got an open heart to embrace others, to see with 2 eyes, and an open mind to accept the changes that come. And we've got lots of different ways of doing things. What could be better if I say, come into the Botanic Garden with me? Let's crystallise a new project together. Let's prototype, learn to fail fast. And if it succeeds, we'll do it at scale. That's where we're at the moment in the Botanic Garden. We're also trying to see with both Western science and also that indigenous folk knowledge that comes from embodiment. We've forgotten, who are the indigenous people of Edinburgh, of Scotland? Who are they? They're not the Highlands in the kilts, with the bagpipes. That's a sort of an artificial construct that was Walter Scott, isn't it? It's all of that. The reality is indigenous lowland people, their voices have been lost. They've been written out of the history books. But their songs and their poems have been recalled, and they are there still if we choose to look. And they're about the land. They're about land use. They're about land cover change, and all of those stories we're bringing out. But also those stories we borrow from where our plants come from. They come through in our collections. And here's the human ecology theory of change, which means that I don't have to be a master in all these things, but I have to be aware of them and engage people. That's why I don't just talk about plants. I talk about people. I talk about places. Because spaces become places imbued with emotion through the actions and reactions of people and the environment. That's all it is. That's what a garden is. There is all this nature and experience cycle, and any of you are familiar with John Dewey. He's often used in pedagogy with educationalists. He's often used with artists. And they talk about the experience of the environment, the thought response that comes from that, epistemology, the different ways of knowing, the actions that we alter the environment through the techniques that we approach, the shape that shape the next experience as a cycle of experimentation and growth. What does that mean at Dundee? Because that's what you need to get back to. What does it mean? What did I do? The first project I did was create a medicinal garden with the life sciences to bring the plants out of the building that they were only seeing at a molecular level or on a screen, so they could see the plants every day, but also engage with the visitors in what those plants are. What was surprising to me is many of those people had never seen the plant they were working on. Yeah? I could tell you about misidentifications, but that's another story. Because you can imagine a body of work that you've got under the wrong name. That causes problems, doesn't it? We also went deeper. We went out to our plant scientists they work at James Hutton Institute. And James Hutton Institute and the Division of Plant Scientists are using molecular techniques So really big projects, barley, potato, how do we feed 10 billion people? How do we do that sustainably? What does that look like? Breeding techniques, old and new. But their public engagement was always about art. But it wasn't art like I'm talking about, using an artist to tell your story. It was a nice piece of art on a wall. And in fact, I have to be careful here, really, because I was shocked that there was a building that you had to have a staff card to get into to see a public engagement exhibit of art in the heart of the university. I couldn't get into as a member of staff. I didn't have the clearance level. And you're thinking, well, that's dissonance, isn't it? There's a disconnect there. Who is this serving in terms of the public engagement, really? So we sat down and brainstormed and talked about a project. Could we use Oxford nanopore technology and take it into a classroom, set up labs with Royal Society funding, and establish research, outreach around a subject that's not a crop, it's not parallel to what you're doing, but maybe it answers a different question that's never going to get funded. I'd come from the NTS, where there was this historic line of Brodie collection daffodils and putative parentage that they could never work out. So we went after that. When we started the project, there was only 3 research papers published on cultivars of daffodils. There's now 9, there's just about to be 27, written by 14, 15 and 16-year-olds, using the same techniques that are used at the labs to solve some of the big crop problems. It's not hard work, science, as long as it's taught well, with enthusiasm, with the right equipment, and children are better at pipetting than adults because they see it as a game. They've got the dexterity. But they're also whiz with the computers at analysing it. And now we've got students who probably never considered plant science as a future career for them, who are looking to go that way for their career. So it's been a great project. And this year we made it national, and now we've got 27 schools across the whole country. And I'm hoping to approach Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh next year to say, Wisley at the moment are working away to try to identify the 56 or 57 different species of daffodils. You've got them in your herbarium collections and you've got them in your living collections. Can we do them all with schools? Just do it. What does that look like? And build the phylogeny out. There's loads of website stuff on this that you can see, and we work really closely to celebrate plants. The Plant Fascination Day, do you do that in Edinburgh? We have this Plant Power Day. It's around my birthday, the 15th of May each year, so that's how I remember it. And we talk about the daffodil project. We also talk about the crops. And this year we talked about those old crops that used to be grown that we're looking to bring back into the landscape through James Hutton. And this is flax. And the flax is being weaved. At the moment, it's pulled then, it's being weaved at the moment. It's turning into an exhibit of lichen, with lichens and mosses weaved into them as part of our 21st of October Lichen and Moss Day. I got it in there. At the Botanic Garden, where we've got a conference going on there about those overlooked and undervalued species. It's a great day. 2,500 people come to that every year. I'm going to go now on to that rewilding aspect, because what does it mean or matter to be interdependent with all earthly life? And I read deep ecology, I read human ecology, I read psychology, as well as botany. And Arne Ness really challenged me. It's the hardest book I've had to read. I forced myself to read it. Didn't really get it the first 3 times. And then something popped, and it was this. And because of that, during lockdown, I saw a pop-up on Facebook of a group in Hampshire that had rewilded their street. And it was done by a marketeer. And I reached out to him and said, oh, that's a really good initiative. I like your branding. Would you do a branding thing for me? I was looking at wilding, not rewilding. I wish I'd stuck with it now. But anyway, that's another story. And he gave me this as an umbrella so I could work with others across the city to think differently about what our city of Dundee could look like. How could we do that? We brought in funding with Nature Scott. And this is the Wee Forest being planned and designed by 6- and 7-year-old children in one of the deprived areas of Dundee, where they then came back and planted that with me. And we're ecologically monitoring that. We teach from that. It's an outdoor classroom. But that's the NHS doctor's surgery next door, and they also use it as an outdoor surgery. So they're the other partner in this mix. That's me smiling with myself in the garden, just as I didn't realise I was being misquoted in a headline that was going out, where I was talking about this need to think differently, and that's me with a faceplant here. Think differently about the way that we think about nearby nature, that we recall what's been lost. If you think 93% of our wildflowers in our meadows have been ploughed up since the Second World War. We've lost 90% of our ponds and seasonally dry ditches in the agricultural land outside. The fastest growing habitat on Earth is the urban habitat. These things are facts, we can actually give them the empirical data behind it. But there's this shifting baseline that we'll hear about from Beth and Stag tomorrow, where our perceptions of that nature and just how diverse those meadows were compared to a diverse meadow today have shifted, shifting baseline syndrome. We've also got this other phenomenon, green blindness. We're now at a stage where biology teachers are being taught by biologists that never learned botany or zoology. They don't know how to identify plants and animals. They don't feel comfortable in that space, and we have to run workshops to help them find their way in. So I talked about that, but this is the way it came back. Rewilding doubters have to have psychological challenge to overcome. Whoa, that's a headline, isn't it? My boss rang me up the next day after reading this one. Kevin, what have you been up to? It wasn't quite like that. But actually, read the whole piece, because it's not bad. It has all those merits in it. And I took them around, and in fact, yesterday I took BBC Out of Doors around, saying, well, what is this rewilding? What are you doing? I said, it's not about core habitats that we're protecting, like Yellowstone. It's not about corridors. We've talked about that in urban areas for years, but it's not about those landscape-scale corridors, and it's not about carnivores. That's not what I'm talking about. But it is about diversity. It is about distribution, coming back to that zoo quarry and people being part of that movement. It's allowing that. And it's also about disturbance. And I'll drop in another word, because you heard a lot about niche. It's about eco-spaces. These spaces in time that are available for a species to be in and then to go. Because I think that's the shifting of our urban environment. We're never going to plan it so it's static. And you've got an area that you call woodland. I mean, that's a social construct. Because woodlands walked before man put a fence around it and said it's a woodland. And you don't have to follow Franz Vera's work for that, any of you into that aspect of it. But this is a Morris Waterhouse deadwood pile. It uses small cord wood to represent the hollow of an ancient tree, because we haven't got any timber over 50 years old. But this also, the work from the 80s and 90s, and at Windsor Great Park with Lynn Boddy from Cardiff University, you get a diversity of fungi come out of this wood that you don't from the individual cordwood itself. Something else happens there. You attract different insects. So we've got life science students, year one, studying that. This is the world's first 3D printed hive. It's actually the second one. The first one's at Kirriemuir. But 3 days after putting it in sight, it was colonized by feral bees. And that's a hive that allows the natural biorhythms of bees to be established. We don't take honey. We don't force feed them sugar. We don't keep them at a stress level. We allow them to live their life, pollinate our plants. But you can listen to their biorhythms. You can measure, record the humidity on your phone, because there's a QR code and a smart internet app in it. So the Internet of Things is involved deeply in the work that we bring to help break that barrier of 10,000 hours to become an expert in identifying Senecio or whatever it happens to be. So there's those hives. We've also been meadow making, and rather than spraying it off, adding a blind of sand and adding a wildflower mix, which is what most urban rewilding does, which I never understand, we have been taking what was an amenity mix, adding yellow rattle, and beginning a process of change that was first raised by the forerunner of the Nature Conservation Council back in the 1970s. We know it works. It's a slower process. It takes 5 to 10 years. It doesn't happen instantly. So we're also bringing in patience, but it's not as slow as you think it is. We then cut and we shrew from one of the 5 wildflower meadows in Angus, which we've identified that predate the Second World War, or they were sown from seeds taken from and been restored. And we've got those dotted through the garden. They're just examples. But we also work with these PhD students who help engage in that nature and come back and work with us to message and talk about. So this is one of the 8 Tayside habitats. There's juniper scrub over there. This is a little brook where we've got the alpine blue sow thistle growing down here as part of a conservation project. Birch woodland behind. And this is Hamer Dodds, who is a natural scientist and an artist working on the nexus, trying to bring creativity in to help those research designers' blocks that must happen, do happen, but we don't necessarily have the same tools as artists have to overcome the blocks. Brian Eno produced 100 cards to come over songwriter's block, and Hamer's curated 100 cards to help scientists overcome their creative block in their sciences. This is Desiree Corral. She's native from Ecuador, and she's researching the material colour. Yeah, she's researching the material colour of Bixa orellana and asking who owns colour. Bixa orellana throws up another challenge for us in Botanic Gardens. Here we have a plant named after a conquistador that brought guns, germs and steel. Took away a plant, which was an indigenous plant with 58 uses, and now it is one of the most ubiquitous commodity crops used for food colorants in things like cheese, in Scottish salmon. You've eaten it today at some point. Anyway, it's the red pigment that's in there. It used to be used as the rouge. It's called the lipstick tree as well. But the indigenous people have lost access to that in the same way they had before. It hasn't even got their name. It's got a name from someone else. So you just got to think in terms of how we see this two-eyed seeing. So she's helping us through that. And here at the bottom, we've got the remains of trees that were blown down in Storm Arwen and Barra, a stingjet storm, a cyclone, a tropical cyclone that came in. And for the first time in our 50-year history, we had 4 stingjet storms in 2 months that blew 48 trees. Maybe climate change, I don't know. But I mean, it certainly seems a little bit odd that we suddenly get 4 of them. But she came in looking for a piece of wood, and I said, how much do you want? And she said, well, I want to make a piece of furniture. I said, would you like to make a piece of land art? Something, so my brief was, can you create something that will engage my visitors and help them to build resilience? Because I've spent my working career cleaning up and forgetting those accidents ever happened, and this time I don't want to. And here it is. Cyclogenesis, the 4 stages of a stingjet storm. I'll come back to that later. We engage with botanic gardens around the world. This is St. Vincent Botanic Garden, where we've been looking at the hidden histories. We've been taking the biodiversity and the change that comes with that to think creatively about how our spaces are not just about living collections, but they're about people. And here's the world's first COVID memorial garden, which is 4 hagstones in pods, each representing in stained glass 2 meters high, one of the 4 seasons we lost in that first year of lockdown. I'm going to flick through these last ones because they show you how we work with our communities to imbue emotion, to create events that are not just about a celebration of artistry, but they also link back to precious resources like water, single-use plastics, and reusing them. They use art to help inform science, the Coriolis effect, the stingjet storms and how they form. They're helping us relook at the way that we interpret. So this is an artist's image with the interpretation board and a fly-through that takes you into the cells of the plants. We're asking questions about food, going back to that land use change outside our barrier, and how we can move from a globally financed to a locally financed food system. And that includes setting up sustainable food places with all of these strategies in place, and we help lead those. And I guess this is where I'd like to end it on, because it's something you can come and join in with us, because we've joined up with a project across Europe as Horizon 2020 called Urban Relief. And that's about establishing a citizen observatory, not just citizen science, but an observatory that engages with big data, but makes it transparent and looks for the gaps and allows the citizen science to fill those gaps. But not only fill those gaps so that we can then analyse them, but to co-analyse them and work with planners so we can plan for a more resilient green and blue conversion of the grey architecture of Dundee today. anyone's interested in that, we have a conference and workshop next June, and you can follow the links to Urban Relief. But there, I think I'll end the talk tonight, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kevin, that was thought-provoking, but more than that, it was profound. And I'm sure people will think about these issues for hopefully days, weeks, months, years, and try to help you in your mission. What I liked about your presentation was your dulcet tones. Some people with this message scream at the audience, but you're a soft, gentle fellow, and I respect that. And you put over a beautiful vision of the world and of people, of how they should be, and I really enjoyed that. I truly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I've got a little question. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and I agree with just about every single thing you said. But one intriguing thing, I should actually say, I work for the Botanics here, and I work in the public engagement team and work in interpretation. Something that's intrigued me, because I'm relatively new to the world of interpretation, but colleagues who are well established in it, but have not come from the Botanic Gardens, they've come from other sectors where interpretation is being used, have told me, and I haven't kind of followed up the research, but they told me that there's good kind of peer-reviewed research that suggests that people visiting gardens are not primed in quite the same way as people visiting museums to kind of learn. So although that, you know, there will be people who come to learn, it's a kind of different setup to a museum situation. So any kind of thoughts and reflections on that difference between gardens and museums would be interesting.
No, I think, well, I'll send you the paper I've just written about new museology and what we can learn from museums in Botanic Gardens, because I think it's actually an unconscious bias. So I was just asked about someone new into the Botanic Garden world who's come from an interpretation background but's being challenged by peers to say there's good evidence to say that we can't do what museums do. I actually think it's partly true because of the way that we set Botanic Gardens up, but that shouldn't stop us trying. Yeah? So I think it's an unconscious bias that you have to overcome, so push through it. They will thank you for it, but not in the journey. Yeah.
Really enjoyed the talk, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, I've visited quite a lot of Botanic Gardens whenever I can. I think they're really fascinating places. I find them very, enticing. However, whenever I'm there seems to be a very, very big lack of focus on fungi, which I find very interesting because of how codependent plants and fungi are with each other. And I know quite a lot of mycological research is quite recent. But I was just wondering if at Dundee, if there's any focus on that, because even at very large botanic gardens, you very rarely read anything about them, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, no, good question and good observation. So yeah, I've visited many botanic gardens, and I think the first time I saw fungi being exhibited in any sort of way was at Doik Botanic Garden, actually. Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh do it well. And I think they're a really good hub for Scotland, and I think in terms of that, learning from each other and sharing, that's something we do well in Botanic Gardens. So although I've been, sort of challenging us to think about what's next, I think we've come a long way. And the Dead Wood Trail is all about that. It's looking at those latent fungi that are already there and how they come out, but it's also allowing us to rewild people's minds. And one of the slides I would have shown you is about how we make that connection between that life around us that we would walk by otherwise, as we're looking at that, it's fantastic redwood over there. Whereas, it's what's really interesting is the mycorrhizal relationship in the birch over there, And we've just got to work harder with our interpretation colleagues, with those artists, to bring those stories alive and make them real for people, Yeah, so yeah.
Any more questions? Yes.
It's Chris.
Thanks very much. That was a really fascinating talk. I think John's right. They'll be all thinking about it for quite a long time. You touched a bit on placemaking, and I was sort of reflecting that some of the time it was about sort of showing global collections, whereas what you were beginning to articulate was a kind of more a local placemaking. So do you see a kind of shift over time, really, of what's in the collection in a botanic garden?
Absolutely. I think if you want to look at an example of that, I'll shout somebody else out, because Becky's here from St Andrew's Botanic Gardens, and Harry Watkins has done some great work there, looking at where our future trees for our cities will need to come from in the world, and how we can use a functional trait-based approach to select them, rather than somebody walking up the Hindu Kush like me going, look at what I've got, you should grow this because it looks beautiful. But, you know, having some sort of scientific evidence behind it and ecological. So what we're looking at collectively, I think, in terms of that new way, Gothenburg, St Andrews, us, Kew, Edinburgh will be doing it too, is that thinking, what's that next generation of plants look like? But I think the segue to make is, whereas Kew and Edinburgh need to fulfill a national role, they can act as hubs with us spokes that can provide a local role. And I think that's the future, because we need, 2050 to 2070, our scenario planning with urban relief is we need plants from southeast England and France. And that's work you've done at the Forest Research that's telling us that. It's been there in the forest industry for years. The provenance is, you're way ahead of us, and we need to do that. Our nurseries at the moment grow plants that were collected by Ernest Wilson and have been vegetatively propagated with a clonal name. Gosh, if you look at the diversity within the urban estate of Dundee, it brings shudders to my spine to think Asian longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, phytophthora, we're in a trouble, So we've got to change it. So yes, and I think that local hub and spoke, I think, go back to, we need a new hooker in Kew or in Edinburgh that has the humility to say, we need to do this together, and we need a national challenge here. It's a hub and spoke. Let's work together. Let's make our cities resilient, because that's where people live. Let's make them work for nature and for people. And I guess that's the slogan, isn't it, in a way? Yeah? Together we go forward.
Two questions. Three people now. And first of all, David.
The question I have is a subject that I've had to lecture on, and that's the Nagoya Protocol. This is what you're talking about, in a way. What are you returning abroad for what you want to gain from abroad?
And I think that's where we need to work together at scale. Put it in perspective, Dundee Botanic Garden is me and 3 gardeners. Yeah. I've got 5 staff looking after 108 acres of grounds. The university's priority isn't the Botanic Garden. So we do a lot of work. We punch way above our work, because I don't, like you, I don't work 40 hours. I probably work 70, 80 hours, and that's what my team does. But together, sharing that resource, we can think differently. So the way we've done it, with our access and benefits sharing, so we've just signed an MOU with St Vincent and also with Malawi Botanic Garden. And I went to Edinburgh and said, I'm going to look at the signing an agreement, but I want you to be the natural partner for the training and engagement. I will go after research grants that underpin the economic aspects of that, and we will manage it. And the access and benefit sharing will be about people. They'll be about the work we're doing to build a future resilient landscape will happen in Malawi and in St Vincent. And that work is signed up. And at the moment, I'm just waiting, fingers are crossed, that we've got the funding. Because if we have, that's the beginning of an example of that in practice.
Very good.
Thank you. Good question.
Hello. Thanks very much. I enjoyed that. I suppose it picks up on the previous answer about the trees to be planted for the future, the next generation, and to what extent you think interpretation plays a role in shifting culturally ingrained narratives, perhaps, about, national trees, exotic trees, native species, non-native species. What do we do with those types of terminology and their kind of colonial legacies?
I guess, that's a really good question. It comes back to the heart of that two-eyed seeing and respect. It's about witnessing, but it's also about making sure that the whole story is told, the true story, not a biased version of that. And that means that we don't write the stories. They're written together. And that's the key. Likewise with the tree selection, the urban relief, we won't select those trees. We will help people see different scenarios with Earth observation data and look at what will happen in Dundee if we do nothing at 2050, 2070 and 2100. That's quite scary in a way, isn't it? Because you're sort of presenting a worldview which is different than where people see it at the moment. But you're also then inviting them into that space to say, here is where mini Dundees are around the world, and here are the things that we can do as part of that preparation, mitigation, adaptation through nature-based solutions. I argue on the campus it's not about planting trees. I think there's too many trees being planted. Sorry, Chris, in terms of that side. Because you only have to look at what happened with Storm Arwen and Barra. 20,000 trees were blown down in the Angus Glens. There's no conservation benefit. There's no carbon being stored in that landscape. It's the wrong selection. And I was told very early on in my journey, you don't need to plant trees. Jays do that far better than us. For 7 jays, in 7 weeks, plant 250,000 oak trees. And oak trees don't grow in oak woodlands. They're shade intolerant. They need to grow in the pasture outside. We've got to take the fences down and allow them to walk. But we can't do that with agriculture and urban land use. So we've got to think differently. And I think all of those things need to go in a mix. And you know, it's okay to say, I don't know, but let's go for it. But only try 10% of it, because we can't fail everywhere, can we? And I think there's really, I mean, I look around this room, we would have an amazing brainstorming session if we just flood up some questions and try to work through them together. We then have options appraisals for the next few years to follow up, wouldn't we? And I think that's probably the way. And that's what urban relief is about. Dundee City Council have done it. And I'll end that bit because we got the council leader, John Alexander, to say, what would your vision be like? He's only 38. What's your vision like for the future of Dundee? And he said, is there an urban nature reserve? I want one of those. What does that look like? And he's asked his team to go away and have that vision. Wow. An urban nature park. That's great, isn't it? Yeah, but I think it needs to be in mosaics. It can't be fixed. And I'm certainly saying don't fix walls and call it a woodland. Allow it to walk. Bring water above ground.
I was going to ask whether, in view of your Act Local philosophy, you work with the council on public parks, and you've really said that. Yeah.
Yeah, we help monitoring. I've got students doing some of their work. There's a brilliant project at St Leonard's Park with SEPA and Dundee City Council and Nature Scott, where they're bringing one of the old Victorian underground culverts, the old burns that used to be in Dundee that were used for water mills. Then they were put away so we didn't see them, so they could reclaim the land over the top of them. And now they're flooding, you know, because we get this episodic weather change, don't they? So they're bringing it up above the ground, and we've been involved in helping species selection, seasonally wet meadows, scoping that out. But I think most of the work is being done by SEPA, Nature Scott and Dundee City Council. And we just say, we're here to support if you need us. We'll be a critical friend. If you need students, we can help with the monitoring and evaluation. It's a learning opportunity. If you want to help with interpretation, we can also be at the front edge of that, and we can prototype in the Botanic Garden. So I've brought water above the ground and show people, hence me getting into trouble in the newspaper. Yeah, because I can do it, can't we? We can do it. And if we can't do it in a Botanic Garden, if we can't experiment there, where can we? Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to draw the discussion to an end. And we must thank you once more for this really enlightening talk. And thank you, audience, for the discussion.